Live streaming is on.
It helps if I plug this in, doesn't it? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just bear with me while I finish getting set up. He's running late at work. He may or may not be able to join me, but we will have a show regardless. I just need to share the links. This is working. Tell because of that. Okay, it does seem to be working. Excellent. Why is that? Okay. That at some point. One. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. As always, I'm your host, Kevin Mears, technologist, paranormal investigator. But you got make sure to tune in again because I'll be doing the 19th century page. How do I put this? Ideas that pop up again and again in folklore all over the world throughout history. Some of certainly these ideas go back as far as we have being a little fun. They're saying there's certain notions, certain concepts in mythology and folklore you can find all over the world in cultures that don't even have anything to do with each other so much. Some of them even show up in cultures that you wouldn't expect. Hey, Teresa. Let me look up one thing in particular. I want to refer back to that. That's what I'm thinking. Okay. Um, and now I'm frozen. Yes, dragons would be a primary example. Some other examples are vampires, werewolves specifically, although actually they're very, very common. But shapeshift can take the form of humans. Spirits of the dead are also incredible. Spirits of a wide variety of examples are very common, including demonic spirits, although they go by this episode. And you can go cases particularly back or about shapeshifters seem to even go back before recorded history. Um, as fascinating as that may be, but it's an interesting question. Why do these ideas keep recurring? I'll start with the first topic: dragons. Yeah, dragons are a pretty nearly universal myth. Tend to be very some legends about dragons more serpentine. Oh, whereas ones in Asia tend to take a more chimeric appearance, being a mixture of animal traits. But there's still common ground, and even in European ideas, you still have some chimeric elements, where these animals are conglomerations of other animals and are supposed to be the greatest of animals, often having spiritual connotations. For example, particularly in Asia, dragons almost take on the level of gods, where an entire river, a particularly important river, may be represented by a dragon, or a lake, or a mountain. Um, in Europe, they also have important significance. Obviously, in the Bible, the devil of Satan is equated with a dragon. Um, in some of the older pagan cultures, there seems, particularly among Druids and some of the Celtic people, there seems to be some evidence of a reverence for this idea of dragons. And it's an interesting question, at least to me. Why does this idea keep coming up? Um, Obviously, I'm not here to claim that actual, literal, physical dragons exist out there in the world. If they do, we haven't found any evidence for them. And you'd think a giant fire-breathing lizard would be hard to miss. Some of it, I think, has actual roots in real-world animals. If you read a lot of the oldest dragon legends from Europe, for example, they're very large lizards. Um, Sometimes they have wings, often enough they don't. They're also very famous for being poisonous. Now, it's not technically a dragon, but it's in the same general category of creature. But the basilisk is famous, and the cockatrice are famous for how poisonous they are. So poisonous that their breath or even their very gaze can kill you. Um, and there is a type of creature that you can find that sort of fits the bill. They're not found in Europe, but they're found in a lot of other places, including Asia, Africa, and parts of the Middle East, and even New Zealand. They're called monitor lizards. The largest and most famous example of this would be, of course, the Komodo dragon found in Japan. Um, which is a very long, sinewy creature. Have what's interesting, I think, at least with the Komodos, is that a lot of their venom is actually bacteria. Um, Reptile mouths tend to contain a lot of very nasty bacteria, and but besides from that, they actually do have a venom of their own right. But what a Komodo will do is it'll bite its prey, and it'll just back off and let the prey die, which happens very quickly because sepsis will set in and the venom will take effect, and then it'll go back and eat it. And again, basilisks and dragons in general tend to have very venomous bites, which raises the obvious question of one of the common traits in ancient dragon legends is fire breath. There's an explanation for that too. Lizards in general have forked tongues. They're pretty well known for it. And I think I'm frozen again. So you'd have knights that would go to the Middle East or to Africa, particularly on crusade. The many crusades to the Middle East, the one to Egypt, things of that nature, that would encounter these huge, terrifying lizards, the mere bite of which would kill someone. And they talk about they describe these lizards to artists and describe these forked tongues. Well, throughout history, just like today, artists aren't always the most literal of people. So what starts out as the single fork, like we all know lizards and serpents have, forks again and again and again until you have this giant ball of forking tongues coming out of out of the lizard's mouth that looks like fire. And that may be why they're believed to breathe fire. Um, and this explanation I think makes sense, particularly because there's a lot of these legends in Asia, and of course Asia is also famous for its dragons. Where I think this gets sort of interesting is you do find stories like dragons in North America. And North America doesn't really have it has monitor lizards. The Gila monster is an example of this, but Gila monsters aren't nearly as big as Komodos or some of the other monitor lizards that are found in the world. This may not be without explanation. Certainly, we know that the Native Americans came across the Bering Strait land bridge around 10 to 20,000 years ago, I want to say, from Asia. So they may have just brought stories from the creatures they knew in Asia with them. Or perhaps migrations and a lot of draconic figures in Native American folklore that I'm familiar with are very serpentine. If people, if there was any point when people from South America got communicated with the more northern tribes, um, I don't know if that actually happened, but I'm just speculating here. Stories of the anaconda, which is an absolutely gigantic lizard or serpent, may have made its way north and influenced things, which may not have been all the way. Oh, somebody came all the way down from the Amazon jungle to North America, the North American continent. It may very well be that they traded with Incas and other people in Central America, and word of mouth spread the story northward. Certainly, we know, for example, stories from Asia made their way into Europe and vice versa through the Silk Road. So something similar, I would speculate something similar might be happening here. The interesting side note to all of this, of course, is the question of water monsters. Of course, the most famous of all would be the Loch Ness Monster, aka Nessie. There is also Chessie, which is the one in the Chesapeake Bay right near where I live, because it's down in Maryland. There is Champ from Lake Champlain, Ogopogo, I forget where he's from. There are legends of these giant, usually very serpentine, sometimes more complicated creatures that live in lakes. Again, going back hundreds of years, that are found in many different cultures. Um, some people have speculated that these stories are leftover dinosaurs, which I think is unlikely. Some people have suggested that they are very large eels or fish, or schools of fish swimming together, giving an illusion of a serpentine body underneath the water, which I think is more plausible. I think also there's an argument to be made that what's being described here isn't a physical creature. Particularly in dragon legends, a lot of legend stories of dragons, when you kill a dragon, the body disappears. If they exist, and I'm certainly not, I've never seen one, so I'm not saying they do. What if they're a type of spirit being, and that's why we can't run off to Africa and go bag ourselves a dragon for Teresa Hall to keep as a pet, since she commented she wants one. There's a very interesting read by a magician by the name of John Michael Greer called Monsters, in which he proposes that lake monsters are a type of dragon. Excuse me. But I think there's another creature that I'm more interested in that I really wish Brian was here for, which is of course particularly the predatory Walking Dead, um, in which we find our vampires are um, various creatures from around the Jiangxi, which is a Chinese creature very similar to a vampire, and endless parades of other creatures throughout from the folklore throughout the world. Um, these are old. These stories are old. To give you an idea, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is of course the oldest confirmed story, although there may very well be older ones in Hindu texts that we simply don't have the ability to translate, talks about in Enkidu, the companion of Gilgamesh, coming back from the dead, walking the earth. Um, Even the Bible talks about it to some extent. There's the story in one of the Gospels that when Jesus rose from the dead, he brought with a whole bunch of the dead in Jerusalem rose as well. Um, for that matter, what was I thinking? And there are there's stories in the Old Testament that are suggested. There's certainly this idea that the dead can walk and retain their intelligence. Not just the mindless, shambling eaters that we see in zombie folklore, or in zombie movies, which aren't even based on zombie folklore, which is a whole other rant. And here's what I find really interesting about this concept. We find, or we have found, I should say, examples of Homo neanderthalis and other primitive humans, where the bodies not only were buried with ceremony, but the limbs were tied together. There's a number of possible explanations for why this would happen, but again, going by what we know of early cultures that exist today, a common reason for a common reason for a lot of funeral practices to begin with is to prevent the dead from returning. The reason that we have wakes, for example, is it was believed, particularly in ancient Greece, that an evil spirit could possess the body and take it over. So someone would wait with it at night before the funeral to prevent that from happening. Similar ideas show up in Jewish culture and a number of other societies, but it's the whole reason they have a wake. In Irish culture, they cover mirrors during a funeral. This is also true in Jewish culture, although it's usually supposed to be for a different movie, a different reason. Because it was thought that reflections could capture the dead. In Judaism, by the way, if you didn't know, the official reason why they cover mirrors, though I've heard that there's a little of both going on here, is that they don't want the grieving to be focused on their own appearance. So they cover the mirrors so you don't have to see yourself crying. And one of the reasons we originally put gravestones on graves, you put a big stone on a grave so the body couldn't dig its way up. I just saw a meme on Facebook referring to a grave that was found in Poland with a scythe buried blade down over a person's neck, which would have been done as a reason for stopping a corpse from rising. Um, but this idea is certainly very common all over the world that the dead can walk. Often, although not always, they require some form of sustenance. It may be blood. Blood is very common. Breath is common, particularly in Asian cultures. Some feed off of offal or simply do, in fact, feed on flesh. And yes, Teresa says in the South it's called sitting up with the dead. But the fact that we, particularly not so much the funeral rites, because funeral rites just ghosts, which is where I'm going to go next. But the tying limbs suggests the fear the body is going to move on its own. Man, this connection is not good tonight, is it? Hmm. And I don't know what to do about that. But and then there are the stories, of course, of people seeing the dead walk, seeing their loved ones come back. In some parts of the world, people still tell stories of vampires. Again, there may be explanations for this. Certainly, it's very common when you lose a loved one to have dreams about them. Um, and for that matter, a number of aspects of vampire folklore could be explained by decomposition. You dig up a body, it's bloated, you strike it, and there's what appears to be fresh blood. Um, when you strike it, groans escape. The blood, basically, when you die, your blood congeals, but eventually it does become liquid again. Um, the floating is, of course, the gases from decomposition, which is also what causes the groaning noises. Um, but there's a lot of weird things that center around the nature of decomposition, particularly even the common myth that your hair and fingernails keep growing after you die. They don't. That's a myth. What happens is the skin tightens and starts to recede and pull back. And when it does so, it makes your hair look longer. It makes your nails look longer. Um, it's basically a trick, not something that's actually taking place. But there's a whole school of thought that this explains vampires. What the problem I see with that is, but why did they dig up the body to begin with? It's not normally something people do. Um, the counter argument to which would be one of the most common explanations for vampire outbreaks, particularly in the Middle Ages, is disease. The famous case of Mercy Brown here in the United States likely can be traced back to an outbreak of tuberculosis. Um, there's a couple of diseases, tuberculosis and cholera being common among them, that the person simply wastes away and dies. And particularly before germ theory, before we understood a lot of modern medicine, well, what's causing this person to waste away, this seemingly healthy person, to grow weaker and weaker and die? Oh, they had a family member who died the same way, and that family member, um, they may have told stories about seeing that person around because, again, dreams and just the nature of grief, and that when someone dies, you often think you see them everywhere. Which also leads logically into another really common thing, which is one of the most universal ideas, which is ghosts. Every culture, every society has stories of the dead coming back. What I find particularly fascinating, the idea of spirits, is there is a tribe in South called the Piraha. To Brazil, particularly the Amazon rainforest. the last subgroup of the Mara people, and live mainly on the banks of the Mace Sea River. What makes these people so interesting, and why many other YouTube channels talk about them, is they don't believe in gods. The entire idea of gods holds no interest to them. There's a famous story of a Christian missionary who went to them and to convert them to Christianity, which is, of course, what missionaries do. And they were interested at first until they were told he had never met this Jesus that he was talking about, and the idea lost all interest to them. And they also he talked about losing a loved one recently, and they didn't understand. It's like, they're gone. Why do you care anymore? So they've gotten this title of the atheist tribe. But the truth is more nuanced than that. Do they believe in gods in a sense? Arguably not. Do they believe in supernatural beings? Yes, yes, they do. They believe in spirits. And there's descriptions of them interacting with the original missionary and with others, and talking about seeing a being standing on the shore right there. Everybody in the tribe can see them, but the person they're speaking with doesn't see anyone there. Um, to me, it's just fascinating because they have this reputation of they're atheists. They don't believe in gods. And it's like, they don't believe in gods in a westernized sense, gods at all, or at least in some sense. Particularly, um, there's a concept in religion that they call animism, which is the idea that everything has a spirit. And that nature suggests that maybe it's more of a form of animism than anything else. But what makes the whole thing interesting, and why on the surface people think of them as atheists, is that they only believe in what they can see. And that's why they rejected the idea of Jesus. You can't see Jesus, so to him they're not real. He's not real. Or he's just dead and it doesn't matter anymore. But they claim to see beings that other people can't. It's not as simple as, oh, they're just atheists. Doesn't mean that it's as simple as they're just theists. They seem to exist in a sort of gray area. We may be looking at a very early form of religion. Um, but again, this idea that humans have souls and that souls sometimes stay is just about universal. Those written stories of ghosts are at least as old as ancient Rome and Greece. Um, but the idea is certainly older than that. You find the idea in Europe and Asia and the Americas, and cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years apart. But very similar ideas. The idea, and one of the most universal ideas, is that if a body isn't buried properly, the soul may come back. You find that in both European cultural traditions, and then you also find it in Asian cultural traditions as well. And again, what I said about vampires, it's like it was very important to people that proper funerary rites are observed when someone dies. Yes, Trace, I would agree that some do stay. I'm also trying to look at it from an anthropological, slightly scientific sense, and what could explain this. Um, it certainly there seems to be some explanations of just the nature of how we deal with grief, but it's odd that it's so universal. There's so many consistent ideas. Sorry. But related, of course, to ghosts as well as the idea of demons, and for that matter, angels, are fairly related here. It's again evil spirits, whatever name you want to stick on them, show up just about everywhere. Again, spirits in general, non-human. Actually, realistically, it's better to say just non-human spirits. In the Algonquin tribes of North America, there's the story of the Wendigo, that a human that eats the flesh of another human will turn into this creature called the Wendigo that is forever hungry and constantly eating the flesh of the dead. And this part of the story is well known, but what's less well known is in a lot of versions of the story, what actually happens is the spirit of a Wendigo possesses this person. And that's what causes this eternal hunger. And that you can try to cure it by exorcism instead of just killing them. In Asia, there's this idea of the Kamai. The Kamai are spirits in the natural world. They're tied to places and animals and things of that nature. They can be good, but they can also be evil. Going way, way, way back to the beginnings of human civilization, in Sumeria and Babylon, there are stories of what essentially qualify as demons. Certainly not all things that in Babylon and Sumeria that are associated with the demonic are inherently evil. For example, the Pazuzu, the demon from the movie The Exorcist, is a god in Babylonian culture. But he's not a very nice god. He's actually a god of disease and plague. But he's also a protector of children. A protector of children from his own wife Lamashtu, who likes to murder children, and seems to have been a forerunner for the Jewish idea of Lilith. But it was generally thought in Babylon that the demons caused disease and disaster. There are the oldest grimoires, the oldest written books of magic come from Babylon. And a lot of the spells in them are there to ward off these evil spirits. Again, Matt, universal concept all over the world. Usually, they're spirits that were not human. They've always been. They can be malevolent. Some of them can be benevolent. Some of them, one of my favorite archetypes that falls in here are the tricksters and the fairies. In Native American cultures, you have Coyote, who is a prankster. Although, in fact, Coyote fills nearly every role you can think of in folklore. Prankster, creator, devil, god, good, evil. In Norse cultures, you have stories of Loki. In African cultures, you have Anansi. And there are great similarities between these three figures. There are differences as well. They're not all interchangeable. But these beings that play pranks, and they usually play pranks either one, to teach a lesson, or two, and directly related to that, two, to take down the proud, to take down the arrogant, take down the people who abuse their power. This idea even appears in Christian theology. Um, Satan is generally considered a bad guy, but he also fulfills the trickster archetype in a whole bunch of stories, which are probably holdovers from older pagan stories that just inserted Satan in the place of a fairy or pagan god. Um, and of course, this falls squarely into my line of work. And for that matter, the idea of possession by these spirits is very common. Possession by spirits in general is very common. In African tribal cultures, their gods possess the worshippers. In voodoo, you don't have to pray to a saint or Loa, in this case, to help you. You can attend a voodoo ceremony, have that Loa ride the body of one of the worshippers and ask them for something directly. You have a direct personal experience with these beings. The Loa are not gods, because there's actually voodoo is a deistic monotheistic religion. There's a single creator god who is absent from the world, who doesn't get involved, and then the Loa are the ministering spirits that work for him, somewhat similar, though not identical, to angels or saints, in particularly in Catholicism, and they're the ones who get things done. But again, in some of the lower can be quite dangerous and malevolent. Um, some of the spirit, some lower have good evil and evil aspects. Some just aren't things you want to mess with. Um, and again, there's this idea of possession. There's this idea, and of course, Christianity and in Judaism as well, under the Shidduchim, Dipuk. In Asian cultures, in India, there are stories of demonic, of what essentially amounts to demonic possession. I think I'll go into one last group that falls into this category that I find particularly interesting because, again, this is one that predates written history. We know that for almost certain, which are shapeshifters, werewolves. Where wolves, where foxes, where lions, where tigers, where bears, oh my. We can find cave paintings going back tens of thousands of years, long before recorded history, of shamanic figures wearing animal that seem to be transforming into animals or have animal features. We can find stories in Asia of foxes that live long enough and are clever enough to figure out how to turn into women. China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all have these stories of foxes. All over Europe, you have stories of men that become wolves or become bears. In the Americas, you have the Nagaloshi, the skinwalker, who can turn into just about anything, even other people. One second. There are certain common features to these stories. They're almost always predatory animals. It's almost always seen as an act of magic, although sometimes it's hereditary. Often it has a very dark connotation as well. Not always. I mean, kitsune, which are Japanese foxes that pull off this trick, are tricksters, but they're not necessarily evil. Um, but the werewolf of European folklore is certainly a malevolent figure. Usually a malevolent figure. There are exceptions. The Nagaloshi of Navajo mythology is a terrifying figure. I mean, to become one of the skinwalkers, you have to murder a member of your own immediate family. It's a pretty dark thing to do, you know? And there may be an explanation for this that lies outside of the paranormal. Because here's what you run into: primitive societies, and I hate calling that because it's an oversimplification, have shamanistic traditions involving what could best be described as totemic magic, although that's specifically the American term. But you find the basic concept both in the Americas and in Africa and in Europe, where warriors and shamans would put on the skin of an animal and perform a dance before the night before a hunt. And the idea was they drew the power of that animal into themselves. Um, and again, you've seen these ideas in lots of places. There are jaguar warriors in the Aztec society that wore jaguar skins. And the particular argument for my point here is the berserkers and the ulfzerkers. Berserk is a pretty common word in the English language. Most people know it these days. For somebody who goes crazy, usually particularly crazy, violent. What's interesting is the origins of the word is from Scandinavian culture. Berserk, meaning bear shirt. It was a subsect of Viking warriors who would don bear skins before they went into battle. And they were famous for their ferocity. They would chew on their shields. They would charge in and just kill everyone, even attack their own people. And they were supposed to be nearly unstoppable. Directly related to the berserker is the ulfzerker. Berserker, bearskin. Wolfzerker, wolf skin. And we know from the Prosetas and other Viking stories that some of these warriors were supposed to be able to turn into the animal they wore the skin of. This, by the way, is probably where we get the idea that it's very hard to kill a werewolf. Because while it didn't require silver in Norse legends about the berserkers, they would turn into a bear during battle and just be this unstoppable killing force. But after the battle was over, they would be exhausted and they'd have to sleep for days. And if you could find one while they slept, you could kill them and they would die, like any other man. But you couldn't hurt them in the animal shape. I think it's possible that this kind of tradition, and whether you want to believe that people can turn into beasts or not, biologically it's not possible, by the way. I've seen an argument that it's a form of astral protection where they can create a very dense ethereal body, spirit body around their astral form that can actually affect the physical world, which also kind of comes up in the book Monsters. But aside from all of that, you can believe that's what's going on. You can believe that it's just stories of these crazy tribal warriors that did these things that get mixed up, and it goes from somebody wearing a wolf skin to someone becoming a wolf. And the particular argument you find there is that in European werewolf folklore, particularly where it ties into witch folklore, a werewolf is a person who dons a wolfskin belt, and that usually given to them by Satan or created through the use of magical ritual. And that belt is what allowed them to become an animal. You could stop their power to transform if you could find the belt and burn it. This seems to tie into this idea of the berserker and the ulcer. I mean, I don't really have a specific point in this episode. It's more of an exploration of interesting ideas. But give it some thought sometime. Why is it that so many cultures have such similar stories? There are many explanations, some paranormal, some not. I mean, another argument that's been made by Carl Jung, the psychologist Carl Jung, was this idea that there are certain archetypes that just recur through the universal subconscious. Um, Maybe it's that. Maybe I find I'm skeptical to say the least, but I've seen a hypothetical argument that dragon folklore is a kind of racial memory buried in our DNA from when our from millions of years ago, when our ancestors were tiny, shrew-like animals, mammals hiding in terror from the dinosaurs. And while obviously we don't have dinosaurs anymore, maybe some part of our genetic makeup retains this instinctive dread of reptilian creatures. I mean, I find the idea a little bit silly, but I don't know. Um, I think that's going to wrap the episode for the night. Um, I want to thank everybody for listening. If you have been keeping up with me so far, remember we're going to be getting into the next chapter of Varney the Vampire, the 19th century vampire novel that predates Dracula by decades. If you haven't been keeping up, please go check out Varney the Vampire 1 and 2 on the channel where I read a chapter, the first and the second chapter from this Penny Dreadful. We have a very long way to go. There are 232 chapters, and I'm on chapter 3. But I'm having a lot of fun, and it seems like my listeners are too. So we'll keep going, at least for the time being. Remember, folks, if you're enjoying what I do, if you want to support me, please consider giving me a like, giving me a thumbs up, sharing this with your friends, subscribing to the channel. If you really like what I'm doing, my Patreon link is in the description. That's patreon.com/demonology, patreon.com/demonology. Everything I do with the show is self-funded. I work a regular 9 to 5 job to pay my bills. Well, I should say I work an 11 to 7, not 9 to 5 job. So any extra money you can throw my way is always appreciated. If you don't have the money, believe me, for the love of God, I understand that because I'm kind of a broke dude myself. So again, the most helpful thing you can always do for me that won't cost you a dime is like, share, comment, and subscribe, or even dislike. Because here's a little secret: when you thumbs down a video, it still helps out in the algorithms. Do it for tonight, at least until I get into Varney the Vampire. This is Kevin Mears, your demonologist, paranormal investigator, paranormal encyclopedia. Say good night and God bless. Good night, everybody.